And so I'm just very briefly going to introduce folks by name and institutional affiliation. Michael Keith will moderate the session and we'll have some comments. Michael is currently the director of the Center for Migration and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oxford. He's been at Goldsmiths for a length of time before that, and what is less known about him, but I think in this context, at least of importance, this is a response to Sola, who's not in the room. He he was the town manager for Tower Hamlets in the City of London for any number of years, and has some harrowing stories to convey about that. If you know anything about Tower Hamlets, it's sort of east of the city in London, east of the central business district in London, and is a site of very, very interesting interactions between changing demographics over a couple of centuries now. Layers upon layers of cultural sedimentation and interaction. So it's a quite challenging place to actually run. Sarah Nuttall is on the faculty, research faculty at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, WISER, at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, one of the premier research institutions across Africa in critical theory and such engagements, qualitative, not quantitative, qualitative research across the humanities and social theory and social sciences. Achille Mbembe is also at WISER, a research professor at WISER, and is equally engaged. They've recently come off running they've initiated the Johannesburg Workshop in Theory and Criticism, which has recently run like less than a month ago, 3 weeks ago, run a 10-day workshop on Features of the Political, which was really terrific. And if you Google the Johannesburg Workshop in Theory and Criticism, you'll find their blog, which blogged a good part of the proceedings and had a lot of very interesting interlocutors involved, and they've written on an edited volume on Johannesburg, and have written about the Afropolitan, so well-placed people to comment about such things. And Chang Ho is a chair of architecture at MIT and himself a practicing architect with an office in Beijing, and was involved, I believe, in the Victoria and Albert exhibition, the introduction to which was in the readings that he wrote, I believe. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, David. We're going to start off with a couple of contributions from Achille and then Sarah, and then Chang Ho will come in after that, and then hopefully we'll open up the discussion for a while. So, Achille.
The remarks I'm going to make are in the spirit of the conversation. They are very exploratory, and so you are free to not take them too seriously. I come to this topic of design from, I would say, the perspective of someone who has been interested in the relationship between power and aesthetics. Have written a few things about it. Some chapters of my work on the post-colony are really about that relationship between power and aesthetics, aesthetics of power, and the power of aesthetics, by which I mean both the inseparability of these two terms, but more fundamentally the real fact that for power to to operate at all as power, it needs it attempts constantly to turn itself into an aesthetic act. It is not always successful in doing so, in which case, indeed, it produces, to borrow from Akbar, fakeness. And the production of fakes via the operations of power is itself, it seems to me, something that is absolutely central to any political design. So, from that perspective, therefore, if you were to ask me to caricature what it means to design, I would say that the project of design is fundamentally a project of rule. A project of rule that is in itself extremely slippery in its very constitution, as well as in terms of the results it produces. A project of rule and the formalities of rule apply, in this case, it seems to me, to three domains which are, I will call, the domains of design. Domains of design are seen from the perspective I have just outlined. What are these three domains? The first one, I think, is the domain of spaces, places, territories, to use a typical Foucauldian take on all of this. So that's the first domain. Spaces are designed, places are designed, entire territories, national territories are also designed. The second domain, it has to do with both populations, individuals and subjects who have to use Norbert Elias' term, to be civilized. And Norbert Elias gives us a very interesting account of the design of subjects in Europe from the 17th to 18th century. Or Foucault, for that matter, a historical account of the ways in which subjects are disciplined, meaning design in this case as a disciplinary process. But it seems to me that there is a third domain of design seen from the perspective of power and aesthetics, and this is the domain of the imagination. I use imagination, I could have used also imaginary. Imagination, in the sense the Indian anthropologist Arjuna Padurai defines it as imagination as a social practice. Imagination as a social practice that has to do, I would add to what Padurai says, which has to do with, on the one hand, the psychic, on the other hand, a term David used this morning, the fantastic. The psychic and the fantastic are not the same things. Although they are relations between them. And the third area is all that has to do with, let's call it the sensorial. The sensorial involving, of course, fundamentally in this case, the visual, the perceptive, the perceptual, and also the affective. So it seems to me that in that sense, design has a lot to do with the constitution of a sensorium, because that's the other way in which power aims to operate. It aims to operate by, let's say, framing the conditions under which the sensorium is constituted, and the conditions under which the sensorium does operate. So that's the first set of comments I would like to make as far as the topic is concerned. The second set of comments have to do, and you understand that they are telegraphic because we don't have much time. I could go through all the things I have articulated. Don't have time for that. The second set of comments has to do with a few reflections on the project of design in a fractured world. Because we live in a fractured world. I mean, I have never been to China. I arrived in China yesterday at around 6 in the evening. And we landed at the airport. It was raining. We got out of the airport, and the humidity was absolutely amazing. I grew up in Cameroon, where it is very humid. I haven't been there for a long time. The moment I landed, the memory of humidity in my own country just clicked in my own mind. And then the sky was terribly cloudy. So I asked my wife, is this normal, or is it a sign of pollution? And and she said, no, I think this is it's normal. No. I didn't believe her that much, so I stand to be corrected. It seems to me, and then we took a taxi, we came through from the airport here. I am more of an Atlantic person. I mean, my whole framework of mind revolves around the Atlantic. It doesn't mean that I haven't been reading about the East. I've been reading about the East, Bar's work, Li Fan, who work, many other works. And I began looking from a distance at this place, Shanghai. And what is striking when one comes from, let's say, West Africa, I've lived in Dakar, I've been to Lagos, which, by the way, we're talking about Rem Koolhaas today. He was very much interested in Lagos, and it would be interesting to see how it is that he sees any continuity or not between Lagos and Shanghai. What was striking, I kept telling myself, is the monumental nature of this place. Monumentality and verticality, a point Sarah was raising this morning. I imagine that Lagos is also monumental to a certain extent. But monumental both in terms of sheer numbers, and I believe that in matters of numbers, nobody really equals China. But Lagos, after all, 23 million people. 23 million people who have to live on almost every day, meaning organize themselves. Monumentality also in terms of the spatial spread of that city. It covers, according to figures which are approximations, 300 kilometers. So I was struck by that monumentality and the fact that we live indeed in a fractured world. In a fractured world, it seems to me characterized by at least one thing, and David mentioned it this morning in his presentation, by different forms of political economy. Different forms of political economy, all of them a translation of the diversity of forms capitalism takes, the different trajectories capitalism takes as it tries to cover the globe. A coverage which itself is always very splintered in the sense that it keeps hopping, it bypasses certain places, it hooks up in others in a very intense manner. It seems to me that it's being plugged here in a manner that is absolutely intense. But it doesn't matter whether it's hopping places or plugging into places. It seems to me that one of the things it does is that it makes the production of science extremely heated. A heated production of science, whether one lives in the townships of Johannesburg or, by the way, in the suburbs of Lagos, or it seems to me here, no matter in fact the speed late capitalism happens to take. So in this context, I have the feeling that the there's something, there are a set of paradoxes the project of design is facing. One such paradox is the fact that design, indeed, the project of design becomes somewhat inseparable from the kinds of debris. I don't know whether that is an English term, debris. The kinds of residues, and I would say the kinds of waste, human waste as well as material waste, capitalism creates and feeds itself off. What I mean is that histories of design under conditions of late capitalism therefore becomes inseparable from histories of waste. And that is one of the big challenges the project of design as a project of rule is, it seems to me, facing, no matter whether we are dealing with Lagos, Johannesburg, or for that matter, Shanghai or Mumbai. The second thing is that is what seems to me, but this is of course debatable, the accentuation of the distinction between, on the one hand, the monumental, the pharaonic, and these are really impressions. You come here and you think, oh my goodness, we are back in pharaonic Egypt. That capitalism here operates along the model of let's say, how could we call it? Marx would call it the pharaonic mode of production. The pharaonic mode of production applied, of course, to capitalism. So the distinction between that, on the one hand, and what we could call, and Akbar mentioned it this morning, the ordinary. What is the ordinary in China, in Shanghai, for that matter? I kept asking myself yesterday, in the midst of these huge, absolutely enormous human structures, where is the ordinary? Of course there is some kind of ordinary. It can even be odd, as Akbar was saying, was calling the oddness of the ordinary. But what would be the oddness of the monumental and the oddness of the pharaonic? It seems to me that is also one dimension we probably need to bring on the table here. Now, whether one deals with the pharaonic, the monumental on the one hand, and the ordinary on the other, and whether in fact such a distinction operates at all, it might not even be a proper distinction. But no matter, so whether one is dealing with one or the other, my feeling is that under the conditions of late capitalism, both are somewhat predicated upon some form of disaster, or some form of the disastrous. That in order to produce the monumental and to produce the ordinary, some kind of disaster has to be happening. Whether in a hidden manner or in a visible manner, and that we have to confront that element of the disastrous and the risky, for that matter, if indeed the project of design, viewed from the perspective of power, is to be dealt with. Now, third point, I have 4 points and I'll be finished. Third point, and this one also is telegraphic and impressionistic. My feeling is that the monumental, the pharaonic, design under the conditions of the monumental and the pharaonic still has to do with the history of modernization somewhat. Histories of modernization, late modernization, but modernization, as you know very well, originally, can define it whatever way we want, it had one dimension that had to do with catching up with some prior project narrative, whatever you want. So the polemical thing I would like to say is that design as a discipline and as a project still is anchored in that project of modernization. Whether really high-tech led modernization as we witness it here, or primitive forms of modernizations as we find them elsewhere. But it has to do with that. That's the first polemical point. There is a second polemical point which has to do with the fact that it seems to me there is a global cultural partition going on in which we live, in which certain cultures, are more or less have to do no longer with design as such, but with conservation, museumification, curating archives, museums along the lines of heritage that has been built over time and that has to be managed. They are no longer really interested in design. And they have outsourced design to these emerging high-turbo capitalist places. Some of them are located in Southeast Asia. And that's where they experiment with design. They themselves are no longer really cultures where design has any fundamental meaning. So you have that on the one hand, where you go to France today, of course, they are still rebuilding Paris. Sarkozy has a big project of Le Grand Paris, but it's a political ritual because every president has to intervene on Paris. From the time of this big destroyer, whose name now I can't remember, Osman. From the time of Osman, you have to do a little bit of destruction. Design, architectural design, urban design, being akin to, you destroy a little bit of Paris, you build a few things, and then you write your name in the long history of these presidents whose big dream basically is to be a monarch. But the point is that the French killed their king long ago, and since then they live in the melancholy of a king, unlike our friends in Michael's country. So you have
killed
that.
Our king and then forgot about it.
No, they killed him and they keep remembering, how he looks like, and reenacting that. So, but I don't want to go into psychoanalysis. Gabi is here for that. So you have that cultures where curating, conserving, the museum is really there, and then I would say. Places in our world in which design, if we have to use that term, is really about composition. Design under conditions of ordinariness. Conditions of ordinariness which have to do a lot with what you were telling us this morning, which have to do with conditions of high velocity. High velocity, at times radical uncertainty, radical contingency, in the sense in which, for most people, and the majority of people, especially in the poorest parts of our world, to make it from today to tomorrow is the principal act of culture. It has to do not only with time, it has to do with temporality and the ways in which one produces culture. And in such context, where you can lose everything instantly, high levels of inflation, and you can lose things you can never recover because the concept of debt in itself is meaningless. In such context, to design is basically to compose. To compose out of the debris and the residues and the waste that is surrounding one. If you go to, places like Abidjan, Dakar, Jakarta, for that matter, you would be astonished at the ways in which nothing is discarded. Because the classical project of design is about discarding. But in this case, in this compositional thing I'm talking about, nothing is discarded because everything is useful, especially what is left out. So it seems to me that a way in which we can also, let's say, articulate a critique of design. Let me end this thing then by another rubric, which has to do with the design as a way of making images, creating images. We don't have the time to go through the a deep anthropological reading of images. I just refer you here to the work of Louis Marin and the likes, those French theorists who have worked on the image prior to, let's say, our times. I would just like to say two things. It seems to me that whether we live in a world saturated by images in the classical sense of the term, or whether we do not, it seems to me that the centrality of images and image making in the cultural economy of our times is something we have to deal with, if only because it is shifting the grounds of human subjectivity. If only because images, however we want to define them, have become not only points of mediation that allow access to a variety of different experiences, not only because they have become more than before interfaces that structure exchange, interaction between people and their environment, but also because it seems to me the borders separating humans from the images they make, those boundaries are somewhat collapsing. And if they are collapsing, then we are entering a totally new economy, not only of how we think, but also how we see and perceive and understand ourselves. I had a last point on people and their machines, but I think I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll move straight on to Sarah.
I'll be brief. Thank you very much. I wondered what Achille was speculating on between 1 and 4 this morning. But, and he spoke for far too long, so I'm going to be briefer. Look, what really interests me about this debate that we've begun to have through the readings and that we've begun to talk about this morning is this idea that we can find grammars of meaning for things we've not yet learned. In other words, I think that the kinds of concept of design that's being proposed here suggests quite radical epistemological breaks and political breaks or ruptures, which probably most of us need to take back to our own work in order to fairly radically rethink that work. And of course, what I'm referring to is the kind of rehabilitation of the concept of design to help us to let go of acts of definition and to take something that we think we already know. I think Kenya Hara said this in the readings, and make it unknown. That's really what I'm referring to. It seems to me that the kinds of places it takes us to, analytically, theoretically, are places like the post-consumerist, and I want to say a little bit more about that in a minute. it takes us into a terrain that is clearly after postmodernism, while we can hear the echoes of postmodernism. And it begins to show us, I think, what a properly ecological analytic might look like while not being confined to the ecological project. So that's really what seems to me tremendously interesting and challenging, and as I said earlier, threatening for some people, most of whom are not here, intellectually, in terms of what we're trying to talk about. And the Bruno Latour piece was particularly interesting in alerting to us the fact that, you know, we're not just sort of moving from humanism to post-humanism. We're moving back and forth between the two. I thought that was very useful. And I think that applies to everything that we want to say and think about. We're talking about a theory and an analytics which is not confined to what is human, but works across things, between what is human and what is not. It does seem to me that the space in which we're working quite decisively signifies the fall of the sociological as an explanatory model, though. I just wanted to speculate about what the things we're thinking about things tells us about consumerism in the way that it's been thought until recently. Partly because I've been working a lot on consumerism in Johannesburg. And it does remind me, and I just want to draw this in, of Bill Brown's work for 10 years now, where he really talks about the fact that cultural theory needs to begin to find a new idiom in which things can't be explained just within commodity relations, but that things are far stranger than that. And that if we're going to think about things in the way that they deserve, we ought to think about what it is to be possessed by possessions, what it is to think about the mutual constitution or entanglement of a subject and an object. So I wanted to really put a question to you about what you think that means for the way in which we write about consumerism. And it seems to me it does mean a certain kind of rescuing of the thing from theories of commodity capitalism, fetishism, commodity fetishism, alienation, and so on. So it does seem to me that there's a certain shedding, theoretical, analytical shedding that needs to take place in order to think about, from a sort of post-consumerist point of view, in order to think about things and how they work in people's lives. Because there seems to be something that's irreducible to ownership, if you like, which is what theory usually focuses on when it thinks about consumerism. There are really quite a lot of things I would have wanted to say. I'll keep those for later. But let me think about, you know, what the politics of location might mean, or what it might mean to think from an African city in relation to this this series of debates on design. And one of the things Latour says is that we can extend the details of daily objects to cities themselves. Well, how? Akbar made some comments this morning that I want to elaborate on a little bit from a place like Johannesburg. Because in thinking from Johannesburg, what we might do is actually think at the limits of an explicitly or self-consciously African aesthetics. And if you work with the idea of a place like Johannesburg as a city in the making, very much as one would with Shanghai, and from the point of view of artists and urbanists and architects, one might think about spaces in the city from which one can take up different vantage points, accepting neither their given meanings or functions. So, for instance, one might think of urban landscapes as kind of inherited territorial machines, kind of up for grabs frames waiting for waves of cultural occupation. So the idea of an African aesthetic, insofar as it still exists, might lie in the power of reinterpreting architectural structures, buildings, that once had very different meanings. And I'm thinking of the kinds of the kind of potent beauty of Johannesburg's modernist structures that have now become detached from the meanings that the apartheid period gave to them. So you reoccupy those structures and those buildings and give them radically different meanings from the ones that they had before. I think that that's what Akbar was really talking about when he talked about any space, whatever, this morning, where ordinary grids have new uses and we recognize them less and less. Yeah, my problem is that I have so many things that I wanted to say. So let me leave it at that. I'd like to just flag those particular issues around consumerism and the African city, and I'd prefer to take up, the rest of my comments during questions. Thank you.
I'm gonna make some comments and observations about design, more from practitioners' point of view. Actually, I wonder if I'm the only non-social scientist in this room, or really a scholar in this hall. Anyway, let me begin with one question. As a practitioner, that question really is there. I'm confronted by it on a daily basis. Do all design make sense? That's the question. I think the answer for me is pretty clear. A lot of them don't. If we heard a definition of design in one of the earlier presentation, if design is about composition, if you use the original definition of design in English, and that would be pattern, pattern making. And then if design is only about aesthetics, and then I think not only that it probably doesn't make much sense, and then design seems to be only a confusion with art. Design and art are not really differentiated, and then design is only a novelty. And then the question can be changed, from does design make sense to do people need design? So we have that question there. And then, so what if when a design does make some sense, what happens? Do people know how to use the design? I have to say, luckily, often people do. If the design makes sense, people would engage it and appreciate it. The best example today would be, lots of them actually, and it's not that rare. Probably it's an iPhone. It's designed for you to use, and you use it, you appreciate it. So that it's not only about how pretty an iPhone looks, but rather there's a kind of a functionality and aesthetics kind of combined in the right way, and so on. And then if design is not only about these really it's a simple visual experience, and then there is a design culture. It means that actually from time to time you need some of the knowledge about design, about that particular discipline of design to really understand design better, and so on. And then in reality, however, as I mentioned before, because not all of the design makes sense, and then there is a lack of a design culture. I understand today people at this conference probably come from a lot of places, and but I'm afraid there are two big countries. Now we call them the G2. There are two countries with that much of a design culture. So anyway, and then what happens? So when people don't really use design, they may actually find design fascinating anyway, and then they consume design. So when they consume design, of course, may not be the design per se, but rather, we heard that also already. We consume the image of design. So design is an icon, but no more than that. And then, of course, we turn design into a fad, and then we only sometimes appreciate the logo on a Louis Vuitton bag, although probably logo is only designed on a Louis Vuitton bag anyway. And then and then we create fake, and that's I'm not going to go in there because I can't compete with Akbar. And so on, and then that's sort of a global trend. So what's going on in China? So design is new in China. So before we always have had craft, and then we still do to some extent, but really the notion of design is still very new. And then so there's a lot of misuse and abuse of design. So because the purpose of design is not very clear, so design basically does become a machine, an engine for the market economy. And first to produce, for my discipline, I'm an architect, to produce spaces for consumption, and then architecture or other design is used to showcase the success of economic success. So again, the bags, the cars, and Mercedes and BMWs and so on. So anyway, and then so maybe just like all the notions, not so easy to define design today. But yet I think, again, based on my experience working as an architect, I do think there's also a rather clear purpose for design, which is to improve people's life. Icon making and all the other things people may like to embrace design for could be all part of it, but there's something very clear and central, which is, again, improve people's life. So for architecture, again, it's a lot more complex than design. If design, as we mentioned, if indeed is often only about composition, and sadly that's actually the case from time to time. So I would like to propose, let's get rid of design. So let it go, it's probably just fine without it. And then if you plan to do some shopping in Shanghai, I hope you do help our economy a bit. That's just an excuse to do shopping. So anyway, actually you happen to go into the right store, you can see products from the 1960s and 50s. They were brilliant designs without design. Some, as Michael's compatriot, Terence Conran, came to Shanghai quite a few years ago, and he was asked to pick some design objects. Almost, he picked maybe a dozen or so. They were all from the 60s and 70s. One, people weren't thinking probably very consciously about design, although there's a different kind of a sophistication and so on. So if we can't really think a different way, and then actually I would even suggest architect not really as a designer, and then we are really engaged in the activity of improving and human living environment, so that we work on the improvement of the quality of life, rather than just a tastemaker and so on. And then if I could redefine here design. Although I don't think I probably heard about it somewhere and read about it somewhere. I don't really remember. But design has to have intelligence, and so actually the Chinese definition for design is very interesting. It's in Chinese is 设计. It means that you set up a conspiracy. I think that's what we do. But it's it's a nice one. So anyway, then just to conclude, I know the word conspiracy has a negative connotation in English, but you set up a situation to let people to come in. So that situation, perhaps it could be called design activism, or in a way, it could be design or anti-design activism. It doesn't matter. And then design would improve people's life, as I mentioned, but also could truly really take on some political and environmental issues that would really be meaningful to our lives today. Thank you.
Okay, I was given the job of moderating this discussion, which I guess I arbitrarily take as redesigning or reshaping. So what I would propose to do, I guess, is to try and just I think we have until about 3:30 and then a break. So maybe what I could do is try and get people to talk to each other by commenting, and try and, if we like to use Akbar's Deleuzean moment this morning, refold some of the discussion to try and get people talking to each other, and then maybe we can open up after the break more widely, if that's a sensible thing. And so in trying to respond to the discussion, maybe I can start with Professor Jung Ho, non-academic from MIT, and with the iPhone, before coming back to Achille and then Sarah in turn, to try and mix up maybe the commentary and ask them to comment a little bit on each other's. And I guess a starting point for myself that I was reminded as Chang Yung-ho was speaking was a visit I made to Shenzhen a little while ago, a couple of years ago. You can date the time because it was shortly after the iPhone had come out, and a good American friend of mine, I don't want to name him because it'd be unfair what I say, had bought an iPhone in the very first wave. And many people in this room will probably be aware that many of the iPhones are actually made in Shenzhen. But one of the things about the iPhones is that part of Apple's implication or complicity in the political economy of our times meant that the way in which you use the phone was very much tied to specific providers, which meant that my friend was very proud of displaying to all of our China colleagues and research colleagues his new iPhone. But because he couldn't use his iPhone in Shenzhen, he had to buy a second-hand, what you call in the East End of London, a basher, which is a cheap phone. So he had his iPhone to take photographs and his phone for his photograph. This was compounded somewhat by when we met one of a friend who's a Chinese, who's a designer from Guangzhou, who was in Shenzhen. When my friend produced his iPhone and took a photograph with it, 3-4 weeks after the iPhone was out, somebody else who better remain nameless, I think, produced his iPhone, which was in Shenzhen, but had been opened up and hacked and rerouted so that it could be used on internal China phone lines. And I say this partly as we're all suspicious of allegory, but I suppose what I wanted to open up a little bit comes into Achille's. Achille, when you talked, you used the metaphor of the sensorium and the design of the sensorium in this extraordinary city specifically, but I guess in the generic urbanism of the contemporary more generally. And I suppose one of the things I was then thinking as you were speaking, and I think hopefully this will eventually come back round, is that the sensorium itself kind of makes us think of Zimmel, who says that rationality was about the edit, right? I mean, the kind of classic notions of modernity that you draw from Zimmel is that out of the multiplicity of the sensorium, one produces a form of cutting, a form of substitution, a form of reduction that produces a surrogate for the rational. So the rational becomes a form of editing which is to some extent arbitrary, which might make us think a little bit, I guess, about something to challenge what you said maybe just a little bit and hopefully join up a little bit, is the notion of what is truthful and what is not, I suppose, is partly qualified by the arbitrariness of the edit. And the arbitrariness of the edit in a cultural economy of design and rationalization is, I think, potentially particularly problematic epistemologically and ethically, and how we think about that might make us think a little bit, I guess, about the fake, to come back a little bit to the iPhone, and what the fake is, both as an object, as a thing, and as an ethical object, as Latour talked about in the piece that Sarah referenced. And I suppose in the spirit of these things, we might remember that there is a tradition of thinking that would kind of praise not just true fakes, but the true. I mean, Fanon talks about the importance of the true lies of the everyday world. And I suppose to come back to a sort of more banal level, one of the things I might want to kind of open up and ask all three members of the panel a little bit is, how do we think in that context about design and designed objects in both a global and a specifically Chinese context, where notions of intellectual property are moot globally and have specific articulations in relations that tie this part of the world to other parts of the world, whether in terms of true fakes or not, which I suppose also I'd kind of maybe like to ask all three of you about whether, I think Achille, in your talk, you characterized, I think you described China as capitalist, and clearly without kind of sidelining or digressing too much, I just wonder whether the forms, the configuration of social, political and economic relations that we see can be quite so easily captured. Akbar this morning talked about the oxymoronic notion of the surreal notion of the socialist market. But I think there might be ways of thinking about some things in a conventional China context that might make the notion of market socialism potentially open up some differences. So there's a second point, I guess, there about where we are thinking, and then I suppose maybe thirdly and lastly, before I try and get people to come back, I like Sarah, was very impressed in some ways by Latour's riff on design, although I thought there was a kind of a slight overdetermination of the fact that Latour will always give the objects a good line, and so the ethical dynamics, the aesthetics, the agency of the objects and things themselves, I think are fine. Although I myself was not quite so sure about his notion of design being almost innately progressive politically. There was a sense, actually captured. I've written down one small. He says one time, designing is the antidote to founding, colonizing, establishing, or breaking with the past. It is an antidote to hubris and the search for absolute certainty, absolute beginnings, and radical departures. And at lunchtime, I went quickly Googled. It reminded me of something in complete contradistinction to that, which is Walter Benjamin in the opening of the Arcades talks about empire as the state of revolutionary terrorism, for which the state is an end in itself. Just as Napoleon failed to understand the functional nature of the state as an instrument of domination by the bourgeois class, so the architects of his time failed to understand the functional nature of iron, with the constructive principle where the constructive principle begins its domination of architecture. These architects design supporters resembling Pompeian columns and factories that imitate residential houses, just as later the first railroad stations were modelled as chalets. Construction plays the role of the subconscious. And just after that, he says, the concept of the engineer which dates from the Revolutionary Wars, starts to gain ground, and the rivalry begins between builder and decorator. And this is the comment that that Latour piece reminded me of. École Polytechnique and École Beaux-Arts. The architect, as technocrat or auteur de vie, is kind of almost emerges at a particular moment of time. And so the kind of production of the subject place of the designer in China, in the States, or elsewhere might make us think slightly, I think, more cautiously than Latour about this kind of celebration of design, but also I might want to kind of ask Sarah a little bit about what that might mean in terms of your argument about the collapse of the sociological narrative, I think. So maybe if, for the moment, what I can do is put each of you a little bit on the spot in the order in which you kind of contributed, and push you just a little bit to speak to each other and respond in those terms. And we'll try and do that till about 3:30 or so, and then take a break and open up for discussion.